Everybody for listening tonight. So as noted, we'll be talking about the feasibility assessments, the Heritage Conservation District feasibility assessment for Beaverbrook. So just to give a quick overview of what these HCD feasibility assessments are, they're essentially a pre-study in advance of a potential Heritage Conservation District study. So their purpose is to assess the potential for an area to be designated as a Heritage Conservation District. And we'll go into a bit more detail as to what that means, the sort of process of assessing potential. They establish a kind of formal process for updates to city staff's work plan for heritage conservation districts. And their outcome is ultimately to recommend next steps to address heritage goals in an area. So potential outcomes could include recommending pursuing a formal heritage conservation district study and producing an HCD plan for an area. Things like heritage character areas or design guidelines, individual designations, or even ultimately not pursuing any heritage conservation efforts further. So for Beaverbrook specifically, just to give an overview of some of our progress to date, at the end of last year, we did start our kind of information gathering and historical research stage. So looking at pulling together specific property data and information and beginning to compile a overall history of the area's development. Also did start some early outreach, as Neil noted, so undertaking the Heritage Walking Tour with Neil throughout the neighborhood. And at the end of last year, we also did start to put together a draft of a feasibility assessment for Island Park Drive in Ward 13 or 15, pardon me. So that's sort of the area that we're using as a bit of a pilot for this project. So using that area to kind of develop the actual overall framework for the assessments, put together a draft that we can use as a model for the rest of them going forward. So that's the area that we've been engaged in the most so far. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through as well, just to give you an idea of how these are going to shape up. So just to talk a little bit about Island Park Drive and give you an overview of kind of what you could expect from these feasibility assessments. They're kind of like a high-level heritage conservation district study type project as noted. This is just a bit of a overview of the draft table of context right now, but overall they'll go through kind of a project background which covers off the existing heritage context and policy and regulatory context in an area. Present a bit of a historical overview, so looking at how an area developed and what its historical value is in terms of its associations, etc. Cover off the outreach and engagement activities that happened for that assessment specifically, and then undertake a character analysis, so looking at the actual architectural and contextual character of an area, producing a list of preliminary heritage attributes, and then ultimately also completing an assessment of designation potential, looking at the applicability of some of those designation criteria that the Heritage Act prescribes. And then finally, covering off those in a findings section and producing some recommendations about what to do next. So just to give an overview of kind of what some of that looks like, again, looking at Island Park Drive, this is the preliminary list of heritage attributes that work has produced. So looking at some contextual and associative attributes. So things that kind of contribute directly to the kind of contextual value of the area or have significant associations. So there have been some properties with, for example, associations linked to the early Jewish community in West Ottawa. Attributes that reflect different aspects of the streetscape and public realm. So in Island Park, for example, there's the very wide grass boulevards, the presence of mature trees that kind of link the street together across its length, the different architectural styles represented, and then also some periods of significance that are important to the development of that area. So we'll be doing something similar and kind of compiling everything into this sort of synthesized and succinct level for Beaverbrook and the other feasibility assessment areas as well. In terms of a timeline and next steps, and this is all kind of subject to your opinions and your recommendations as well, but currently in the first quarter of 2025, we'll begin working on a draft of the actual feasibility assessment document for Beaverbrook and coordinating some actual engagement sessions with the goal of having that draft completed in Q2, along with actually undertaking those community engagement, public info sessions, and possibly bringing the feasibility assessment forward to Build Heritage Committee in potentially May or June. As Neil noted, if we are going to be pushing maybe a bit beyond the AGM that's scheduled for later this year, this may end up getting pushed out, and we're very open to that, in order to ensure we get adequate public feedback as this develops. So just to talk a bit about what the assessment approach actually looks like, it's kind of a two-pronged approach that we're taking with this. So on one side, there's I'm calling the character analysis. So basically kind of a visual assessment or analysis of the area, looking at, what is the area's architecture? Is there consistency throughout? What's the integrity of some of these properties like? So have there been lots of alterations, changes over time? And then what are some of the key historical associations that kind of contribute to that character? And then on the other side is the more kind of technical exercise, is this criteria assessment. So as was mentioned earlier, Ontario Regulation 906, that's a regulation under the Ontario Heritage Act. It prescribes nine criteria that are used to assess both individual properties and districts for designation. So in the case of a potential heritage district, the test for designation is that 25% of all the properties in that area need to meet at least two of the nine criteria. So what we've been piloting in Island Park and we'll be applying to the other areas is essentially taking a look at the key attributes and elements that get identified through that character analysis stage, and linking those to some specific criteria, and then doing a kind of high level exercise to identify the presence of some of those attributes and tick off some of the more consistent criteria that can be applied across the area. So in the future, if a full heritage conservation district study was pursued, we would have to do kind of a comprehensive property by property assessment to look at every single one of those nine criteria for each of those properties. But in the interest of efficiency, and for the purposes of kind of determining if we think that pursuing that study is appropriate, we're doing kind of a higher level streamlined version of that through the criteria assessment. And just to give kind of a quick example of that, it's basically we've picked the criteria that we think are broadly applicable or have kind of easily identifiable, highly relevant characteristics that can be matched up with properties. Put that into a spreadsheet with some drop downs, and then are totaling up the actual total number of criteria met for each property. So at the moment, it's looking quite high for Island Park. Those are some draft kind of results based on our current interpretation of those criteria. But it's basically, as I said, a high
People
level
in Island Park
evaluation.
haven't seen yet. Sorry, Greg.
Yeah, sorry. They haven't
You're
seen this
you're
yet.
the
Still
first to
subject to
see this.
change. Yeah.
Sorry.
Nope, that's okay. Um, as I said, sort of a high level evaluation with kind of a smaller subset of those designation criteria. And the idea there is to measure the potential of the area to meet the test for designation. So knowing that when it's actually tested formally, it would be a lot more stringent than this, but basically to give us an idea of whether or not we'll even have the possibility of meeting that legal test. And when we make our final recommendations, these results are considered alongside that character analysis to make some recommendations, because the way that the criteria are structured, there can be some kind of disparities between what we see on a visual level and what's assessed in this chart. So to kind
Sorry,
of begin
Greg.
talking about,
Can I interrupt for one more second? Sorry.
yeah, of course.
Um, just to give the group a bit of a sense of kind of what the criteria are. So they're divided kind of into three categories. The first three criteria are associated with architecture primarily. So it's like, is a building a good example of a style, a type, or not good example, representative example, or an early example, or a rare example of a style or type. So, and then talks about craftsmanship, and then there's one about scientific merit, which is not used very often. And then 4, 5, and 6 are related to kind of history associative value, for being kind of what's the historical theme that it's associated with, who's the important person, that kind of thing. 5 being what can it tell us about the history of a community? And 6 being about, is it associated with a builder or an architect of local significance? And then 7 and 8 are kind of contextual criteria, where we would build in that streetscape piece, all of those kind of public realm pieces that you would have seen earlier that Greg was talking about for Island Park. I think there's a lot of similar kind of public realm features for Beaverbrook as well that would be attributes of the district. And then 9 is about landmark. I think most of these properties will not meet the landmark criteria individually. So sorry, Greg, I just wanted to give, because we talk about them so often, we know them off the top of our heads, and it's good just to give you a sense of how they work.
Yeah, and if anybody has more specific questions about them at the end, happy to talk about them. So to jump into just some of our kind of preliminary findings with Beaverbrook, one of our main kind of findings at this point is that the current assessment boundary is probably too large to actually support a heritage conservation district. It's very, very big. It covers kind of the entirety of the of all of the different Beaverbrook subdivisions that were built out over the multiple years. And at a sort of functional level, it's likely a bit of a challenge to support an HCD across this large of a boundary. So one of the things that we're strongly considering at this point, and we do want to get your feedback on this, is compressing or making this a bit of a smaller boundary. Um, and we have two potential options, but again, these aren't set in stone here. To kind of look at some of the original streets of the earliest subdivisions in Beaverbrook, particularly focused in around Rainy, Tiffany, Leacock, and Pentland, with the potential of including some of the public schools and parks, so Stephen Leacock, Roland Missioner, and then also the associated park with those. So that is kind of, I think, a key aspect to discuss before we do take this any further, just because we do want to, have a kind of clear understanding of the boundaries that we're working with before this goes any further. And just to kind of continue on that theme, um, in that regard, the heritage value of the area we found kind of really emphasizes the actual area's context over the value of individual buildings necessarily. And kind of the reason I'm bringing that up, and it's a question that we have for you specifically, is really to consider, is there value in what we're kind of considering a traditional heritage conservation district approach? And I'll give a couple examples of that in a moment, but what that basically means in sort of a traditional heritage conservation district is that there's a lot of city oversight and permitting related to kind of basic alterations. So things like window replacement, cladding changes, et cetera. Um, because we are seeing that a lot of the value in Beaverbrook really comes from the kind of contextual value of this grouping of buildings and their relationship to each other, and not necessarily the unaltered status of an old historic building. Um, we're considering whether or not, that sort of typical, if you want to change your windows, you need a permit approach, is appropriate, or if there's room to explore other options as well. And in that regard, I think the public outreach and engagement aspects of this project are going to be really important in determining our recommendations. Thinking about, broadly, what does the community value about the area, and is there interest in an HCD at first? And I think also, is there awareness of what an HCD actually can achieve? And does this approach actually achieve what residents are interested in when they think about conserving the area's heritage? So just to give a bit of an example in terms of what HCD guidelines often look like. So this is an excerpt from the Briarcliff Heritage Conservation District Plan, Briarcliff being a pretty good comparison because it is a mid-century modern heritage conservation district. Um, this is just about windows specifically, but basically this prescribes some pretty specific guidelines and requirements around how window alterations will be happening. So in Briarcliff, basically the standard is to either repair historic windows where possible, or replace them in kind with a window that matches the original window in terms of shape, size, profile, etc., and also material, while also maintaining those original fenestration patterns, etc. And all of this is undertaken through the city's heritage permit process. Um, that's a delegated authority process that's completed at the staff level for things like this, but for larger projects, so certain alterations, additions, etc., that's actually a process that goes through the city's Built Heritage Committee and Council. So I think it's going to be really important just to kind of build up an awareness in the community as to what the potential outcomes of a heritage conservation district could be, and that includes sort of some of the oversight that could be included as part of that from a city level, or from a city and then also property owner level. That being said, one of the other possible outcomes of the feasibility assessment is looking at actually alternative tools to recognize and conserve character. And there are some different examples of this throughout the city. So One being a heritage character area. A recent example is in Carlington, just south of Carling Avenue, towards the experimental farm, and putting together a heritage character area. So this is an approach that's actually established under the city's official plan. It's not a designation, so it doesn't regulate demolition or alterations to buildings, but it does establish guidelines for alterations, new construction, and then also aspects of the civic or public realm. And it kind of gives city staff and the community a bit of an in when there are discussions around things like, changes in the right of way or applications at committee of adjustment to kind of consider the heritage character of an area without establishing an additional permit process for those alterations. There's also the possibility of pursuing Part 4 designation. So Part 4 designation is a designation of an individual building rather than a district. So potentially looking at pursuing designations of some individually significant properties, or also looking at approaches through the zoning bylaw. So in certain areas of the city, there are specific exceptions to the zoning bylaw that kind of inscribe things like a consistent setback that's historically found in those areas. So there might be options like that. I think one of the things to consider there is the unique like front yard garage condition that some properties have. Those are pretty interesting and kind of unique to Beaverbrook. So that might be a potential tool to help conserve some of those attributes and elements of the area. So that kind of concludes my information sharing, but we do have a number of questions. We don't need to go through these in detail right now. You can take these back and discuss them, but we can also have a discussion right now. But number one, whether the group has a strong opinion on the proposed boundary reduction for the project. Do you feel that all of Beaverbrook should be included, or should there be a different area that we're not including right now that should be in there? Are there any thoughts on that sort of traditional HCD plan approach in terms of the level of regulation that could be found in the area? And is that the right approach for Beaverbrook? And then what kind of public information or engagement session are you hoping to see happen for the project? What do you think will be effective? What have people responded to well in the past?
Yeah.
So for Kevin here, how did you arrive at the streets that you are considering? Are they the original streets that were first built in Beaverbrook? And
yes. Oh,
okay. Then why, like, how do the other streets that aren't included in that differ, or like, what would be the thing that designates those streets you're suggesting from other areas of Beaverbrook?
So on the left hand, that's the kind of current boundary. So that's the entirety of the original Beaverbrook subdivisions. The two on the right cover off the original streets that were constructed, I think, mid-1960s. I'd have to get the exact date, but those are the first few streets that were built along with the public schools. So the rest of them came afterwards, and other parts of Beaverbrook were, built out by Campo rather than Tarrant, for example. So there are some distinctions just in the architectural and landscape character, and then also the different historical associations, like who built it, etc.
Yeah, and maybe if I can just add on to that, I think our other thought on this was thinking to, the things that Neil showed us and the things that we observed, being that kind of like varied architecture, parks, the pathways, the institutional buildings. Like, we were trying to kind of capture what is like a core sample of the neighborhood. But as Greg said, like, we're not married to this at this point. We were concerned that as we get bigger, it will become harder, I think, with particularly some of the condominium streets and things, I think, to meet that 25%. And so we're trying to, we know there's a strong, or it seems like there's a strong interest for this HCD, and we're trying to find a way that we think there's a boundary that can support it, basically. But this is really just ideas at this point.
Okay, and the other point, the other feeling that I would have about this is, I grew up in the city of Ottawa, in the East End, and I heard about this magical place out in Canada, where they did these ridiculous things like told you what color you had to paint your house. You couldn't have a clothesline, I heard, and so it seemed really, when I heard of that, of course, I was only a kid. I thought, like, why would anybody want to live under those restrictions? And it seems like when Canada then became part of the city of Ottawa, everything was off the table, and people just did whatever they want. But and I think the neighborhood still looks good. But I see that as going back to that, which I saw as a negative to Canada in the time. So that's a thought. And I'm on Tiffany, so this would apply to me. So that's a thought.
Sorry, Kevin, can I just clarify? You would see going back to being restricted as a negative?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, no, I just want to make sure that we're getting it. Okay, that's good to know.
Because I saw that as why would a community restrict itself like that? And again, I was only a teenager and whatnot. I didn't own a house, and I didn't know what that meant. But I saw that as a negative, and why would anybody want to live under those restrictions? And I see us the potential heritage area conservation district going back to those things that I saw as a negative.
May I speak?
Go ahead, Bina.
Yeah, thank you. I actually would like to recommend that you increase the boundary to include Kingsford. Kingsford is an essential part of the catchment area of the original Stephen Leacock School. It is a part of the network of pathways that show that Stephen Leacock was intended to be a center of community. The other area that should be included, I believe, is the Beaverbrook townhouses and that small shopping center at the corner of Beaverbrook and Terron Road, because those were parts of the very first thing that Terron built. The houses opened for buyers in the spring of 1965, and by the end of September 1965, same year, Terron had built the community swimming pool at that shopping mall, and the original shopping mall was built within the next year. Terron's whole focus was community, that people would live and work in and play in the same community. Now, I find it very interesting also that right now the Ottawa Public School Board is going back to the idea of community schools, which is what Leacock was in the beginning, where they want to have all programming for all children within a walking distance of the school. And Stephen Leacock was the perfect example of that. It was the hub of the spokes that went out to the different small communities, the street communities. And Kingsford is a very essential part of that, because it's the whole back part of the Stephen Leacock playground. And the park that is behind the Kingsford houses, that's just a critical part of the whole concept that Terron had, as were the townhouses. The townhouses were built very early on because Terron did not want this to be only a community for the rich, for the wealthy. Yes, he focused on attracting some movers and shakers at the beginning, because that was the key to moving things forward, to establishing the community. But you can't ignore the importance of the community center, because that was the rallying point for the whole community. There were constant community events that happened in the community center, and it was the focus. Terron dedicated space and a group of volunteer women, mostly women, who then seconded their husbands to build shelves, but they created the volunteer library where everyone in the community contributed books. And I just cannot overstress that this sense of community, this sense of place, is what Beaverbrook was all about. And I'd also like to just address the issue of the covenants that were in place. Terron put a great deal of money why were those covenants put in place? Well, a lot of money was put in to have all utility services underground, no telephone poles, no hydro lines. And he then didn't want to have clothesline poles in the backyard. But I can tell you right now that my mother-in-law and pretty well everybody else had a clothesline umbrella in the backyard, which worked very well for drying clothes. So that wasn't a problem. And when we bought our first house, which was in 1971, I remember friends, disparaging the fact that, we couldn't paint our house the color we wanted, and we had to abide by some nature-centered colors. It wasn't a case of you couldn't paint your house another color. It's just that you couldn't paint your house purple. And we have a very ugly yellow house right now on Penfield, and I wish that we could get rid of it, just like the purple house that's on Varley. But, people are entitled to their own opinions. And I remember saying to friends who were disparaging this, and I just said to them, if your sense of personal identity is dependent on you painting your garage doors bright yellow or bright orange, then obviously Canada is not the place for you, because Tehran wanted that the landscape became the central focus of the architecture, the landscape. And that's what we have to stress in this heritage project. If we have a heritage designation, it's not about the shape of the windows, although I understand that, and I'm very glad I kept my windows looking like original. But it's about, don't make your house more important than the environment. And if there's anything we've learned in the last 25, 30 years, it's about the importance of community and of allowing nature to provide us with the calm that we need to be able to live in close proximity to other people. Done.
Okay.
Hi, this is Rob. I'd just like to echo and just reinforce what Beata just said. There were a million nuggets of knowledge that are so important when we're talking about this subject, not the least of which is the community center and the shopping center that by today's standards would describe Beaverbrook as a 15-minute or walking community. Everything's within 15 minutes of that. Even the larger Beaverbrook footprint, but also the community center was the municipal government for what was Canada at that point, including all the volunteer stuff that you talked about with street captains and all sorts of innovative ideas to keep people in touch with their neighbors, and the idea that the Leacock Public School was the heart of the community and tended to link. Quite often through the children, but link neighbors together because their kids were doing similar things, activities with as children's groups, whether it's Cubs or church or school-related stuff. But anyway, great job, Beata. Good to see you again. Thanks.
My hand is tired from writing.
Okay, hi, this is Peter Chapman. I've lived in Beaverbrook for 40 years now. Actually, I arrived and lived on Carr Crescent in 1985, having moved from the UK. I live in Pentland now. What I really like about this neighbourhood is the fact that the through traffic is separated from the residential streets. Beaverbrook Road and Terran Road basically have no residences on them, and I think that's an absolute really key feature. Is this something that the Heritage would take into consideration in terms of, I'll call it comfort and traffic safety issues, which they've been here for 40 years and are timeless, and they're almost unique to this neighbourhood?
Oh yeah, I
Sorry,
was going to
Liz.
say, I can't see you, Greg. No, you go ahead.
Okay. I think, especially at this stage, it's certainly something that we can consider and take into consideration. It's one of the reasons we come and speak to you, because we don't have the same lived experience in the area. I think from a Heritage Conservation District perspective, in terms of its actual, say, the actual implementation of an HCD, traffic could be a challenging aspect to integrate into that. But I do think what you spoke about, the lack of through traffic on those residential streets, could be something that was identified as a key attribute, and could, in the case of a district or guidelines, et cetera, I think would be probably useful in informing how the area evolves more broadly, say if there are, traffic studies, et cetera, going forward. So I think it's something we can consider. I don't think I've have any experience particularly actually implementing something like that, but
Well,
I think it's a good idea.
just to add in, yeah, I mean, it was definitely designed as a 15-minute community without putting the name to it. It was until the late 90s when basically, people voted with their wallet when they put in the largest Loblaws in Ottawa at the center. And suddenly nobody was shopping at the local Lobes slash, which is now Metro. And that was the beginning of the end for that as being the local shopping mall. Right. But it was it was the center. And in fact, I've done measurements that said even in the winter, your average person from any point in Beaverbrook can get to that mall in 15 minutes. So that was, just the fact that it was designed and laid out exactly to meet that criteria. It was not a coincidence. Now, one of the other things that I've started having discussions with the owner of the Beaverbrook Mall is he has been sitting on a development approval to do a full 3-story expand, tear it down, put up, three stories, and 6 stories where the existing tennis courts are. And I want to know, he's well into his 80s. It's a family-owned piece of property, and at some point that's going to get sold. And I think it would be to everybody's complete disappointment if suddenly we end up with a 30-story tower and none of the facilities, no community center as a result of them. So from that standpoint, certainly I would echo Beata's comment that is a very historical core to the community was that mall. It had everything. It had a bank. It had had a bank, had a liquor store. It had every possible thing to be complete as a community in terms of the kinds of services. And across the street, of course, were legal and accounting services. So that whole corner was part and parcel of that.
Yeah.
And that's really helpful. I think that's an oversight on our part. So I really appreciate that feedback.
If you take a look, yeah, sorry. If you take a look at the aerial map that you have of Beaverbrook, where you have Stephen Leacock actually right smack in the middle, and you take a careful look and you see how like a spoke, okay, not a very nice wheel, but like spokes, like rays, the pathways go out to all of the communities. When my children were growing up and we were actually on the other side of Terron Road, other than crossing Terron Road, my children could go to take their bikes and go to visit their friends at the far end of Lismore without traveling on any busy streets. And, that is really what the heritage aspect of the essence of this community is. It's not the houses. We have some, yes, typical, nice, mid-century modern homes, and some of them are very distinctive. Some of them are not really that different from what you see in Bell's Corners or in Qualicum, which were other areas where Terron built. But what is essential, the quintessential part of the original Canada is the fact that it was meant to be a complete community. And we don't do that anymore. We don't have developers who can allocate the space. You've got the woods there that are not even being included in this. The Parkway Road, which was the original entrance into Beaverbrook before the original entrance into Kanata before Beaverbrook really became a main street. It was just the truck route. And It was meant to be a vista coming into Kanata, a welcome and a sense of presence, a sense of arrival. That's why the gate was there with the big beams across the top so that truck traffic could not come in that entrance. Truck traffic was relegated to the Beaverbrook Street. Like there are so many soft criteria here that made Beaverbrook unique. And I'm afraid that if you're only looking at the built heritage, you're going to lose a lot of that.
May I weigh in? I'm Laura Hogue. I live on Varley Drive. I'm a mere infant. We've only been there 35 years. To your point about expanding the boundaries from what you have as a suggestion, I would agree with what others have said and think about taking that boundary out to the corner of Tarrant Road and Beaverbrook Road, which would serve to include that little hub where the mall was and the fire station across the road, and the Beaverbrook townhouses, the Leacock Lane townhouses, which is one of 3 or 4 collections of townhouses that were included in the original subdivision. And I think that is an important piece to include because of the sense of community as being a mixed community. It was supposed to be families, people who wanted a detached home, people who couldn't afford a detached home, some rental, some owned. That whole mix is important. And the fire hall is across the street from the Beaverbrook Mall. That was part of that central hub as well.
And the library.
And the library was in that space as well. Yes, absolutely. The library's now down near the high school, but it was in that building after it left the Beaverbrook Mall. So I would seriously consider taking it out to that corner. So you would have northern edge was Beaverbrook Road, then Tarrant, the Parkway, and the Hydro right-of-way. I think that's maybe a logical area to include. It's a pity you can't go further north, but I certainly see the argument about too large an area becomes too cumbersome. To the point people made about the built heritage, one thing that's interesting about Beaverbrook compared to other subdivisions that have gone up in Kanata North and Kanata South and elsewhere, is the varying setbacks. I think somebody mentioned those garages that sit forward. The houses were very intentionally placed on the lots, that some were further forward, some were further back. Some of the garages are set forward, some of the garages are flush with the house. So you don't end up with a wall of houses all lined up. And I think that really speaks to the character, is that variety. I think if you really look, there are half a dozen different models of home, but because of the way they're set on the lots, it doesn't have that monotonous look of a modern subdivision. It's very distinctive. Okay. And I think that's an important point to raise.
Can I just add to that? I walk all the time. I live on Pentland. I walk through Pentland, Kingsford, and so on. There are no 2 houses that are actually identical. They've all got a different arrangement of the windows. Some of them go right down to the floor, some of them don't. And, as we said, garage is set back and set back. They're all the same style and the same vintage and the same, but they're all got a slightly unique, as I said, I do not know of 2 houses that are identical to mine, at least in the areas that I regularly walk.
And I see Alice Wilson Woods included in I think it is included in. Oh, good, because that's an important pice too. I mean, there's a lot of teenagers spend a lot of time in those woods. We'd all miss this.
No, I mean, I think this is extremely helpful. And I think, as I said, an oversight on our part in terms of that, like, core of the community, which now that you're saying it out loud, it seems so obvious and seems a bit silly actually that we missed it. So I think that boundary makes a lot of sense. What are your thoughts on extending just over to Roland Michener? Do you think that makes any sense, or like one of the other options we could do? Because I think like Roland Michener, if we're talking about architecture, that one's a very interesting building, and it could potentially stand on its own as an individual building as well. So like that's another option, is like in terms of the history of the way the neighborhood grew, does that make a logical boundary, or would it be better to just deal with it separately?
On that point, I would say that including Penfield would be something to consider, because Penfield it's not quite the same vintage, but it's on the other side of Terran Road. But in its own way, it's achieved a slightly higher density, but at the same time, it hasn't lost some of the key features of Beaverbrook. Just a thought.
Yeah, and Roland Michener School is very distinctive, and if you look at the history of the school, is how it was supposed to be used. It was supposed to be an open plan school. It was very innovative at the time. They've struggled with it over the years as how to make it work, but it was a very, can I say it's kind of a 70s thing to do, is really trying to think it out of the box when it came to education. Some parts of it worked, some didn't, but it's a very distinctive building.
How important is it here that we are trying to limit it to a Terran creation, the Terran creation? Because Roland Michener was not.
Yeah.
It was not part of Terran's architecture. It certainly is an example of mid-century. It was completed, I believe, in 1970. And the concept of it absolutely is, a perfect example of the educational philosophy of the time, with a central library and classrooms arranged around the perimeter. But Terran did not have anything to do with the design of that school. I just want to point that out.
Yeah, so that might mean that it doesn't make sense to include it, and that we should consider it separately.
It's a separate, maybe as a separate entity.
Yeah, exactly. And that might make more sense that we assess it individually rather than as part of the. Because part of drawing a boundary for a heritage conservation district is also like there has to be some logic behind it, right? And so I think, the discussion we've heard here tonight about the shopping and the core of the neighborhood, and then making sure that we're like including some of the natural space, the pathways, the parks, the things that make Beaverbrook. And then if we look at it being kind of the original piece as the like most historic, let's say.
Yeah. So most historic, really, also the Varley, they were called the Varley Apartments. I think they're called the Willow something Apartments.
Weeping Willow Lane, yes.
Yeah. That was also a part of that original community, just saying, okay, because it was, again, part of the having housing available for all kinds of different levels of participation. Yeah, well, there's a nice round house.
Yeah, so for those who, once you've seen some Frank Lloyd Wright homes and you come and look at the Roland Michener, you go, I think I know where the idea came from. These are all Frank Lloyd Wright houses in Arizona.
Yeah, actually, there was another one that kind of referenced Roland Michener as well. By the way, Roland Michener is truly unique in the bricklaying that was involved, because it's an ellipse, and every part of that wall has a different curvature, both inside the building and outside the building. And the bricklaying talent and skill that was required to build those walls is absolutely phenomenal. And per square foot, actually, that school was more expensive than any school in the Ottawa, per square foot, more expensive than any school in the Ottawa Carleton Board. As a school, having taught there and having had my kids go to school there for part of the time, it's a terrible building. It's just an absolute disaster as a school. However, architecturally, it is incredibly unique. And the original skylight, which was over the library, every pane of glass in that skylight was curved. The whole thing was this big curved glass enclosure. Now there's straight panels of glass because of the expense. And the elliptical chimney that went up for the furnace also, of course, is being removed. But like it just the quality of the workmanship that was required to build that school is something that you don't see anywhere anymore. Definitely that would make it. Now I have to just say, at the very beginning, when Beaverbrook was first built, what is now the park, the municipal, the city park, soccer fields, and then the school ground, all of that was the original sewage pond for Beaverbrook. Oops.
So one thing I'm just throwing up again, another little piece, which is this is on the northeast corner of Terran Road at Penfield. This is a very quiet looking thing. It is a seniors residence. It was originally part and parcel of that whole, and again, the intersection of Penfield, Terran, and Beaverbrook Road. All of that, in fact, the legal buildings, the gas station itself on that corner was original. Right. And you can see the tie-in, and I mean, we all walked through there. We didn't walk over to look at this because it doesn't look a lot like Reedy Court and some of the other co-ops. But that, if you didn't know, it was a seniors residence. Now, most of the facilities are in behind it. So again, they've got a big front yard here. But that is also part and parcel of, and again, it's sitting right out the back of the mall. So it was in the back of the firehouse here. So it was all in a very close proximity to that. So that was, again.
And it is still a seniors residence.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
So
I actually had meant to mention that as part of my thinking about increasing the boundaries and taking it out to the corner of Terran and Beaverbrook, because that seniors residence is tucked in behind, and that is part of the design of a mixed community. And I had meant to mention it. So.
Yeah, and I think
original.
I think that's helpful about the to go back to the comments about the townhouses as well. Like I think that idea of, mixed community, aging in place, all these sort of things that are planning buzzwords now are the things that we would need to capture, I think, in order to kind of tell that story.
Yeah. And the Elsie Stapleford Child Care Center, Early Childhood Care Center, which is on Terran Road, but at the edge of the same community. That was another aspect that was built. I think it might have been a little later. That might have been mid-70s that was built. But again, it is very much in the style of Beaverbrook, and it was built specifically to provide the whole range of care for families from infancy right to old age.
Yeah, in fact,
we north of the retirement home. Is that north?
No, it's on the west side of Terran Road, just south of Beaverbrook, tucked in behind that commercial building that's on the corner.
Okay, yeah.
So also an important part of the.
I'm looking at an aerial photo. That's why I'm looking over here.
Yeah. So there's the Beaverbrook Mall on the north side of Beaverbrook Road. The south side of that is a commercial building, which is an important part.
I remember that building. Yeah.
And then behind that, but facing Terran, is Elsie Stapleford.
Yeah.
And Bill Terran built that office building, which is on the south side of Beaverbrook, opposite the mall. That was built also by him, specifically right at the get-go. It was within the first 2 years, and it was doctors' offices and legal offices. So again, he was trying to make sure that everything a resident needed was within walking distance.
Yeah, and if you recall, and I'm just going to pull up a quick screen share of the child care center. That was when we walked from Beaverbrook Road.
Yes, I remember now.
From Terran over to Kingsford, we passed that building. So there you go.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
So because we walked up by the side of it, right, Neil, and through a pathway.
Yeah, so it's got a direct pathway straight over to Kingsford, to Varley.
Thank you.
I know.
I'm an
Sorry,
East Ender,
Leacock.
so I am only in Beaverbrook for work. So,
Well, you should move here.
oh, I live in the poor man's Beaverbrook. I live in Blackburn Hamlet in the East End.
That's a really nice community too.
It is. We have very similar things in terms of pathways and stuff.
Yeah.
Hey, well, this is really helpful. We don't want to take up your whole meeting. We've already taken up probably more time than you had planned for us. If you have any other thoughts, obviously reach out to me or Greg. Greg is, as he said, the file lead for the project. I think you've given us lots to sort of help us refine things before we go more broadly public. So this is really helpful. And I think maybe we can give some thought to how we do the broader public consultation based on your advice, Neil, in terms of that we may get a lot of interest. Because
Yeah.
I mean, even at this smaller boundary, it's still something like just the rough math on what we showed you tonight, not including expanding it a bit, is still about 250 properties, a bit more than that maybe. So it's still quite a large area and a lot of residents who would be potentially affected depending on the outcome of the work.
Well, certainly the one thing that people are going to know what's in it for me. So part of it is if there's one thing that I would say is, if it's not top of mind, it probably should be for a lot of people, is okay. So we've heard of this as of right to drop a four-story, up to 12, 8 to 12 apartments anywhere in Ontario. And there's just one little problem with that. My street's only 6.5 meters wide. If you park a car on one side of the road, the plow cannot get down that street. So, you put in something that's, today with such poor public transit and I mean, we have literally one bus that runs during the day that's in the community. Every other bus that goes through here is a commute to downtown, or that's its purpose. So having a car is not an option. And the second is say, oh, well, we'll put this in, people will take transit. Well, there's no transit to take. So, the fear is that something gets dropped in across the street, and suddenly we've got 8 to 10 cars for that one property, and there's nowhere to put them because the street is so narrow. And you can just imagine what happens in winter when the windows start closing in. I mean, you get to the point where even now, even for this fairly mild winter, it's one lane. So this is the kind of fear that people have, and what they'd be looking to block is somebody dropping in something that is as of right anywhere else. Well, that works okay in, say, Morgan's Grant, where your average interior street is 11 meters wide. It's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah. So I mean, I think just not to discount what you're saying, but I just want to caution the group that Heritage Conservation District is not a tool to stop new development in a neighborhood. So it's not going to change the as of right zoning necessarily. What it can do is massage what the building looks like. So I think, one of the things we've been batting around is and I think this group has sort of confirmed it today, that perhaps we don't care about windows, but maybe we care about sort of natural color schemes and use of certain kinds of materials, maybe, but we don't care if somebody changes their windows. So maybe there's a way for us to exempt that from the district. But, if hypothetically someone were to come and propose a development, we would likely not be in a position of saying no to a development. We'd be looking to try to manipulate the design of the development to make it more compatible with the neighborhood. And so I just want to caution that this is not typically used as a tool to stop new development in neighborhoods. And I think, as you all know, I'm sure, because you're all smart people, it's all, the city and broadly, I think the world is under a great deal of pressure in terms of providing new housing for people. And I think we risk losing the credibility of heritage conservation if we start to use it as a tool to block new housing. So I just want us to tread carefully. I'm not saying that your idea is wrong,
No.
Neil, and that there's no way to like work within that box, but I just want to be clear that it's not going to be like a okay, no new development in our neighborhood now.
Well, we've been through this for ongoing, I mean, at least the last 25 years. So Beaverbrook was really the first place anybody looked to build anything more than, 2 or 3 story buildings outside of the Greenbelt. I mean, we've got To the Parkway, we've got 1131 Terran, we've got all the developments happening south of Campo. We've got, Stacy going in, which is, 4 story, several hundred apartment buildings. And that's fairly unique outside the Greenbelt. And that was done on property that avoided that collision kind of problem by putting it in a vacant slice of land that had the support for that level of traffic and access and commercial vehicles and service vehicles and everything else that just would not fit anywhere else. There's just no room for it. Now, one of the things I would ask is setbacks. So, you get your typical Westboro, the setback is like, you've got a meter or 2 before you hit the front of the building, which would be very much out of character. So if setback of the properties is, and my house is, I'm on basically, if you include the right of way, because I'm on a corner, it's 100 by 80 feet. The house is shoved into one of the corner of that lot. So it looks like, my God, you must have a huge backyard. No, I've got my backyard and side yard. The side yard on one side is a rock outcropping that my air conditioning sits on. and the backyard is only about 10 meters deep. But I've got the frontage on it matches everyone else in the street. So the setback is, I'm going to guess it's, 20, 30 meters. So, is that not part and parcel of the community character that, if you're going to bring in some renovation, you're going to put something that's right at the street? That's a question.
Yeah, I don't know. Greg, you want to answer this? I saw you unmiked. I'm sure you love talking about setbacks. So.
Oh yeah, I'm a big setback guy. For sure, there are a lot of examples actually of HCDs capturing specific setbacks as part of the character of an area. Often it's kind of opposite to what was described here, where we're actually looking at a consistent street wall, but there are options to kind of recognize the bit of a variation in setback as well. And as Leslie mentioned, recognizing a setback with an AD would be a way of kind of massaging the appearance and the kind of building envelope of a property or of a development without actually limiting, say, the density or the unit types, et cetera, within that. So it's certainly an option for something. There are also some examples in the city where outside of a heritage district, there has been a specific kind of consistent setback that's recognized through an exception in the zoning bylaw. So there are a lot of potential options that you can explore with something like that, especially in an area where it is significant for its character.
Yeah, and I think in an instance like this where it's like not completely consistent, we wouldn't be saying like if we go back to the Island Park example that we were talking about earlier, like that's very consistent. Like we could measure it and it's very much the same. And this would be more like, I think, a broader kind of like generous setback or something like that would not be necessarily a number, because then we're able to recognize the differences and that sort of thing. So
I would like to offer a perspective here. I think I've made certainly without foaming at the mouth too much, I hope. I've talked about the sense of community and the sense of presence, and that Terran was trying to achieve. Terran was also all about environment and being environmentally responsible, which is why there were very strict rules way back when it wasn't popular, that thou shalt not cut down a tree that has a caliper of more than 2 inches without permission, that kind of thing, which is pretty, standard now, that you protect tree roots when you're putting in infill, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think, given what I remember of Bill Terran, he was certainly in in accord with using modern building techniques for the benefit of the environment, etc. So I don't think he would have had a problem, for instance, with vinyl clad windows, as long as the colors were in keeping. He would have been, I know when he built his house in the Rockeries, all of those curved glass walls are triple glazed, right? It's not that he tried to recreate a house that he built in 1966 when he was building his house in the Rockeries. It was his awareness of new technologies, new requirements to be, environmentally careful. His house, if you were talking about a house that should be, a standalone, I would say that house certainly should be. He put, the roof of that house is entirely it's a green roof, right? That was landscaped so that the house would blend into the environment. The glass on the windows was reflective glass so that the house reflected the landscape around it rather than dominating the landscape. He was very progressive. I don't think he would have had a problem with someone deciding that they needed to put in new windows that were triple glazed or vinyl clad rather than BC red cedar, which is what was originally used. So I guess the question is whether or not what I'm saying kiboshes, the possibility of heritage status. But we do have, in those areas that we've expanded the boundaries to, there are a lot of houses that on the exterior still look essentially the same as they did. And where additions and changes have been made, in general, they're very simpatico to what Teron built and what he would have approved.
I don't think that necessarily kiboshes the idea entirely. I think it's going to require us to talk, Greg and I, to talk a little bit, and with our team as well, because it would be a very different approach to a heritage conservation district. I don't think it's impossible. It's something we've been batting around for years in other areas as well. When Greg was working on the Carlington character area, one of the ideas there was also thinking about doing what we were kind of calling like a stripped down district, like it not as regulatory as far as like building specific things, but regulatory about things like landscape and setback. And color is an interesting one because we typically don't regulate color in any district. So even if you're in like if you live in Lower Town or Center Town where your house is red brick, if you want to paint your porch pink, have at her. We don't think like it's not great, but it's just not something we typically regulate because there's such a wide range of colors, and color is seen to be a reversible intervention. But I think in a neighborhood like this where it is so consistent is something to think about for sure.
Well, the interesting thing is, of course, in some, if you take a look at, let's say, for instance, St. John's, right, where all of the houses or many of the houses in the Heritage District are painted in really bright colors.
From there.
That is a part of their essence, their being. And I'd also like to point out, as far as color in Beaverbrook goes, nobody, the bylaw enforcement officer didn't go around checking the colors of garage doors, right? There were people who, my next door neighbors, let their teenage son pick the green, and he thought he was picking a nice grass green for his garage doors, and it turned out to be fluorescent lime green, and those damn doors stayed that color for about 30 years. So, it was up to the neighborhood to say, this is against our covenants. And people didn't do that. People looked out for each other. So it was not, I doubt that, you know, anyone has put nasty letters in the mailbox of the house that's painted bright yellow on Enfield Drive. Although I've offered to repaint it, well, I've thought of offering, but I haven't.
Well, as one of the few people I suspect that is actually completely refurbished one of the redwood windows. I've done it in the living room I'm sitting in. I completely stripped those windows. In fact, I dismantled them partially to make sure, and I found out that the redwood was in absolutely pristine condition and finished in just a standard old style urethane finish. They're absolutely freaking gorgeous. And you know what? They're as tight as the day they were put in. So anybody who has done that, and I know for a fact that I would guess 60 to 70% of all the windows in Beaverbrook have been changed. You just can't tell because people put it in with something that looked a lot like what came out. Right.
Yeah, I look at the windows as I walk, as I said earlier. I don't know a single house that's actually changed the shape or size of the windows that I look at. The only thing that one does change, and I did this with mine, is I went from 4 panes to 3 panes because we were able to, but that was all. That's the only difference. And it's the same size, the same overall size, just bigger panes.
Right. I think we've flogged this horse to death for one evening. Nothing but people who don't have an opinion on the neighborhood.
Great. You're talking to also two very opinionated people, one of which is louder than the other. That's me. But no, this is really helpful.
So yeah, as I said earlier, I think what people are going to want to understand, and this has been true for all sorts of different scenarios over the last 20 years. Okay, what's the exact details and what's the impact, positive and negative? Educate me so that I've got all the facts. So being 100% upfront on what it can and cannot do, I think would be useful, and also let people know that here's how much you get to decide in terms of what the leeway is, in terms of some of these characteristics, in terms of what you're willing to live with and what you're not prepared to live. And I think that will lower the temperature and get a much calmer, informed response. Because the people in this community, like I said, we've been through, a dozen different development applications over the years. The community's gotten extremely heavily involved. And Laura, but there's always somebody in there says, "Oh, I didn't know about this. Oh, it's in my backyard. I'm offended." So you always get some of those. But generally speaking, people have been in through that because we have had so many development applications, which is unusual for this small an area. Canada South is not seen anywhere near the number of development applications as just Beaverbrook has had. So there is experience in this in terms of planning matters here. So I think you can, take that in terms of a level of knowledge. Now, obviously, there's newcomers who are in here, but generally speaking, a lot of people have some passing familiarity with that.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for the conversation tonight. It's really informative and very helpful. I think we both, learned a lot, taken away a lot in terms of our understanding of the neighborhood and where kind of people's heads are at with this whole project so far. So looking forward to continuing to work on this with everybody, and really appreciate all the time and the feedback tonight. So yeah, thank you so much, and we'll be in touch.
Can I just say one last thing? Having said, the boundaries should be expanded to make this really reflect the community. If that is going to prevent you from moving forward, I'd rather have you do the original 3 streets, Tiffany, Pentland, and Leacock, than not do anything at all. But I think you would be missing the essence of the community.
Well, I think if anything, this conversation has given us this makes it a stronger argument.
Yep.
So.
Well, thanks for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry that we took up your whole meeting.
Thank you.
Have a great evening.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.